Hello again. Thanks for sticking out a long day of panels. We've got a few more. And thank you. Is it okay if I call you Mr. Vice President?
Not at all. Not at all.
I just want to get ahead of this thing.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So.
Let me start by just posing a basic question about the work that you're undertaking at HUD. I interviewed Ben Carson, the neurosurgeon who was running for the Republican nomination, and asked him about spending money on diminishing income inequality, raising middle-class wages, improving the life prospects of those young kids we've seen in Baltimore and Ferguson, that sort of thing. And he said, look at the last 50 years. We've spent X trillion dollars on these programs. They haven't worked. Spending's not the answer. So I guess the question I would put to you is, how would you answer Dr. Carson? Well, I'll stop there. How would you answer him?
It's a great question, and one that people on both sides of the political spectrum, and most importantly, American citizens are interested in. I would say that a lot of it actually has worked. A good example of this was in the news just a few days ago. There was a report about a study that Raj Chetty and a couple of other researchers had done that looked at the housing choice voucher program that HUD has administered, basically a voucher program to let folks who are in poverty, living in highly concentrated areas of poverty, to move out to lower concentrated areas of poverty. And it looked at the effect, particularly on young people, on their earnings, their educational achievement, and found that when you compared the earnings and educational achievement of folks who got those vouchers to folks who did not, that there was a significant difference there. Mm-hmm. So that with that subsidy, basically, that housing choice voucher, what they got was better opportunity and better outcomes in life. Now, I think everybody would agree that not everything that has been tried has worked. I would also say that we have to keep getting better about measuring not just the inputs. We cannot be satisfied in public service just looking at the inputs or how much money we spend on a program. We also have to measure the outcomes, and we can get better about that. But what we can't do is we can't pretend, like some want to, that if you spend no money on something, you're going to get the same results as if you spend a decent amount. That's not true either.
When you think about the work that you're doing, and I see that you're doing a lot of holistic work, blending housing with other programs and services in communities, do you think that government needs to spend the money that it's already spending more wisely, or do you need a lot more of it?
I think that there are more resources that are needed. I'll give you a good example of this. We're able to serve at HUD 1 out of every 4 folks who qualifies for our programs. And since January of 1981, the number of employees at HUD has actually gone down from 16,500 down to under 8,000 today. So this idea that every department in the federal government has just grown massively, that's just not true. And we can see that, and HUD is a good example. We do need to invest more resources. We need to invest more resources in 2 ways at HUD. First of all, in these housing choice vouchers. Unfortunately, the latest markup of the fiscal year 2016 budget would cut 100,000 housing choice vouchers from what the president has proposed. And secondly, in addition to moving people to areas of lower concentration of poverty, we need to focus on those old neighborhoods, those neighborhoods that are still impoverished, where the schools are failing, where the housing stock is not up to standard, where there's limited access to public transit. That, I think, will be one of the defining legacies of this Obama administration, because Promise Zones, for instance, has been all about challenging local communities and challenging ourselves at the federal level to break across the silos and not to see a problem as just a matter of improving housing or improving education or improving transportation or small business, but doing all of that at the same time. And in doing that, holistically lifting up the economic opportunity and the quality of life of neighborhoods, and this to the folks who are concerned about cost, saving money.
Now, I know a lot of what the administration has been engaged in over the last couple of years, since Republicans have held the House and now the Senate is resisting attempts to cut discretionary spending, including the kind of programs that you administer. It appears that in the Congress, the attempts to cut further that portion of the budget have kind of run out of gas. Everybody's acknowledged that enough's done on that. But indulge me a mind game for a minute based on your conception of what actually works in the areas that you're charged with. How much more money could you effectively spend? If they gave you twice as much as you had now, could you put all that to work in ways that you think are known to be productive?
You could. Do I think that's going to happen anytime soon?
Well,
no.
of course not.
However,
but you think you could?
You? Yeah, and let me tell you why in a precise way.
HUD is shovel ready for twice as much money as it is
certainly.
Right now.
Let me give you an example. This Housing Choice Voucher Program that I mentioned, we have in city after city, whether you go to Baltimore or you go to my hometown of San Antonio or Los Angeles or Boston or even smaller cities, thousands and thousands of people in each of those communities that are on a waiting list right now who qualify with their income and every other qualification you need to get through, every other hoop that you would need to jump through. Right now, if you had the resources, you could make the very difference in their lives in terms of educational achievement and earnings that research that was a multi-year effort has demonstrated is there. So the answer to your question is that with many of our efforts, absolutely.
Right. So you said accurately, nobody's going to get twice as much money, but it does seem to me that a core challenge for people who believe as you do about these programs is figuring out a strategy for getting some amount more. Now, I wonder if you look at the level of public investment we've had in the kind of areas that we're talking about right now, it simply hasn't gone up. And we've had, by the time President Obama leaves, we will have had in Bill Clinton and Barack Obama presidents for 16 of the last 24 years who support more public investment in those programs, and yet it hasn't gone up. I guess what I wonder is, have we proven that it is not politically possible to get more resources for those programs?
No, I don't believe that. In fact, I believe that for folks who are watching the mood right now of the country, a greater focus on income inequality on both sides of the aisle. The minimum wage passing in 5 states, including states that are very conservative areas. What you see is the political mood of the country beginning to move back in a certain direction. Now, I'll compare that to more recent polling that was done about trust in government. So I think people understand that there's a challenge there, but they don't necessarily trust government to be the one to deliver it. Mm-hmm. I believe that the further that you get away from that generation that came up with Ronald Reagan as a response to the Great Society, and you talk about these millennials and younger folks, that you're going to get a reset there, basically. Mm-hmm. I mean, you talk to somebody that's 30 years old that was born in 1985, they don't remember that fight. And so I think the challenge that we have is A, to learn from what succeeded in the past and mistakes of the past so that you don't repeat that. B, to strike this kind of deal with the American public that with these resources, we're also going to have better measurement of outcomes and be able to keep what is working and adjust or throw away completely what is not working. And then C, to ensure that going forward, that we have a big tent appeal to who's actually benefiting from these programs. And I say that because in my experience, one of the things that we did in San Antonio was that we expanded pre-K education, significantly expanded it, and we went to the voters and got an 1/8 of a cent sales tax to do it. But in Texas, like a lot of other states, they don't offer free pre-K to middle-class families. You have to have a income cutoff of less than 185% of poverty level, or be a military family, or be disabled, or some other reason, ESL. I think the next opportunity for Democrats and people in the middle is to suggest that with a lot of these traditional bread and butter programs that were developed for lower income folks, they actually ought to also be available to middle-class families. And I think that pre-K is the best example of that.
So if you think you have a set of policies that can work for some of the hardest problems that we face on mobility and inner city poverty, you think you've got an approach that works, you can effectively spend more money than you have, what's the best strategy for getting the money? Is it to propose more money here and less money there, like Medicare, Social Security, the entitlement programs, as a lot of people argue? Or is the better way to say, why should we be bounded by the amount of tax revenue we've got now? Get more revenue.
Well, and as the president's budget, for instance, seeks to go beyond sequester, I believe that that's a good idea, that is a good approach. And I think that these things go in waves. So I do believe that we're going to reach a point where people are more willing, even on the Republican side, the conservative side, to spend more than they have been during these last few years. I don't see that mode that they're in as set in stone over the next even 5 years, 10 years. But I think in the long run, what you need to do.
But what about on the pay-for idea? Do you think they're not set in stone on resistance to tax increases?
I think certain tax increases probably.
Telling pause there.
I think certain tax increases probably you're still going to be able to get. There's some that, yeah, I think most tax increases for a while, it's going to be difficult. But
where would you rather see more money come from? Cutting entitlements or raising taxes?
Well, first, I think that you need more revenue. That's one thing. I'm not absolutely opposed to looking at how we can run our entitlement programs in a more efficient way. But I think that the biggest challenge has been that...
And in truth, the president's budget does both. He does more money from the top in various forms, and he does have some entitlement changes, not large ones, but indicated an openness to discussing those with Republicans, but they haven't been able to make it a...
And also closing certain loopholes that will, gin up essentially more ability to invest in programs. So all three of those things, I guess I'm more optimistic that can happen in the years to come. I do think that when you look at what's happening around the world, that for the first time in the nation's history, we are engaged in this competition for investment and jobs and opportunity with nations that are rising like they never have been before, with bigger populations than us, producing legions of young people who are very well educated, who are ambitious and intelligent and innovative and ready to produce the companies and the technologies that are going to define prosperity in the 21st century. And they're using a model that the United States used after World War II, which was to invest in itself, whether it was in the national highway system or in NASA or in our colleges and universities. It's that good balance between making strong investment and also having a free market economy that led to the success the United States has had. And we're pulling back on one half of that.
To what extent does your optimism on getting more money for the programs that you think work depend on Democrats winning back control of the House and Senate? Because I hate to tell your brother, but most of the people who've looked at the numbers and looked at the districts think Democrats aren't going to have the House for 10 years.
I wouldn't argue that it's a very tough road in terms of getting the House back. I do believe that the Democrats can take back the Senate in 2016, just if you look up at the lineups and what's available and already some of the candidates that are coming forward. It's promising. But I wouldn't disagree that the House looks like it's a longer haul. It may depend on the next redistricting
Right,
effort.
but so how do you get more money out of a Republican House for these programs?
One, I think that you need to be able to work with all three of the buckets that we talked about, and that's what the president's budget seeks to do. Secondly, I believe that we always need to get sharper and sharper about being able to demonstrate with evidence the outcomes of the good work that is happening and why the investment makes a difference. That's why the research that just came out, that's important research. For the long haul, though, I believe I'm not the first one to say that you need to change the way that the redistricting process works in a lot of these communities. And what I'm looking for is what's going to happen with that California model, for instance, which seems to reward people that aren't at either end of the spectrum politically, but maybe center left or center right. If we had a model that rewarded people who are willing to work with the other side more, then I think you could probably get more done.
Final question, because our time is short. How do you think what the nation has seen recently in Baltimore, which sparks conversation at least for a little while, how does that change the work that you're doing and your ability to create change in the places you're trying to create it?
As unfortunate as it is, and it is an unfortunate situation in Baltimore, like other communities that we've seen recently, it does put a spotlight, as the president said about a week and a half ago, on the fact that these are issues between the community and the police, but it goes beyond that. Mm-hmm. It's about creating opportunity in people's lives. And at HUD, that's what we're about. We see housing as a platform to create greater opportunity. It matters where you live in terms of educational achievement. It matters whether you have a place to call home, so that you have the stability to build on of everything else in life. And these initiatives that we do are just fundamental to lifting up the quality of life and the economic opportunity for folks. And so, to answer your question directly, what it does is I think that it gives us more of a tailwind to making the convincing argument and trying to get those resources, and gives us even more motivation to get into these communities. We've already been working on them, but even more motivation to make a big difference there.
One thing I think everybody in this room could agree on, and I'm not talking about 2016, is that we want you to succeed in your work. So thank you very much for being with us.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank y'all.